Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we dive into one of the most shocking and controversial topics surrounding the ongoing conflict, the catastrophic Russian losses that have been reported, while the Kremlin continues to insist everything is according to plan. This situation raises serious questions about strategy, leadership, and the true toll of the war, as new information emerges from the battlefield and international intelligence sources. The contrast between official statements and ground realities becomes harder to ignore. In this video, we will break down what analysts are calling unprecedented losses, how they have impacted Russian military strength, and why officials still publicly deny any major setbacks. In the early stages of the conflict, many observers believed Russia's military power would quickly overpower resistance, but as months passed, those expectations faded. Reports began emerging about destroyed armored columns, abandoned equipment, and staggering casualty counts. Videos from the front lines revealed scenes of burned-out tanks and artillery units left behind. Independent confirmations from satellite imagery and captured soldiers suggested that Russian forces had underestimated the resistance. While leaders in Moscow continued to use phrases like Phase 1 complete and operations on schedule, the evidence painted a very different picture. Analysts began questioning whether the military command had miscalculated logistics, underestimated morale, or faced internal communication breakdowns. As the war dragged on, one of the most apparent weaknesses was the logistical supply chain. Russian units were reportedly stranded without fuel, food, or ammunition. There were accounts of soldiers rationing basic supplies or abandoning vehicles due to lack of maintenance. Supply convoys became major targets, and their destruction left frontline units vulnerable. This disrupted entire offensives and forced withdrawals from strategic areas that had been heavily fought over. Military experts pointed to poor planning and flawed assumptions. The Kremlin, however, described these withdrawals as tactical regroupings. Insisting that overall goals remained unchanged, this disconnect between official language and battlefield reality only fueled further scrutiny. Morale became another critical issue. Reports from captured or defecting soldiers described confusion, lack of clear objectives, and disbelief at the scale of resistance. Many younger conscripts were reportedly unaware they were entering active combat zones. These revelations shocked international audiences and raised ethical questions about forced mobilization. Videos circulated of soldiers refusing orders or openly criticizing commanders. Instead of acknowledging these issues, official channels dismissed them as isolated incidents. Leaders continued to state that the operation was progressing smoothly, but each new withdrawal, each lost brigade, contradicted those assurances and widened the credibility gap. Equipment losses reached levels few had anticipated. Tanks once considered symbols of Russian power were destroyed in large numbers. Modern units were sent into cities with little infantry support, making them vulnerable to ambushes and anti-tank missile strikes. Entire armored divisions were reportedly reduced to a fraction of their original strength. Open-source analysts compiled lists of visually confirmed losses using battlefield images. The numbers were staggering. Yet Russian state media rarely acknowledged these losses, focusing instead on small tactical gains. Military experts outside Russia warned that replacing these vehicles would take years, especially under heavy international sanctions restricting access to vital components. Air power, once seen as an undeniable advantage, also faced setbacks. Russian jets suffered losses from advanced air defense systems that were supplied to opposing forces. Pilots adapted by flying at very low altitudes, but this increased vulnerability to portable missiles. Some reports indicated severe shortages of precision guided weapons, forcing reliance on unguided bombs. These tactics resulted in widespread destruction of civilian areas, drawing global condemnation. Despite these issues, official statements continue to highlight isolated airstrikes as proof of overwhelming control. Analysts noted a striking difference between confident public briefings and the tactical adjustments made out of necessity. International sanctions further strained Russia's war capability. Access to microchips, optics, and repair components became restricted. Factories struggled to keep up with demands for replacement systems. Some reports indicated older Soviet-era equipment being taken out of storage and sent to the front lines. This included decades-old tanks that lacked modern protection. Analysts described this as a sign that reserves were being depleted at an alarming rate. Still, Russian spokesmen insisted production was strong and that modernization continued uninterrupted. The contradiction became impossible to hide as more images surfaced of rusted vehicles returning to combat after minimal repairs. In addition to material losses, strategic positions were lost in key regions. Forces withdrew from areas they had heavily fortified and previously declared vital. These retreats were justified as gestures of goodwill or strategic pauses, but military analysts saw them as forced movements due to heavy losses and encirclement risks. Some withdrawals were carried out under fire, resulting in chaotic scenes captured by drones. The Kremlin maintained that objectives were shifting, not failing, but outside observers noted that the shifting objectives conveniently coincided with major defeats. Each redefinition of goals seemed designed to mask setbacks rather than reflect a real strategic plan. One of the most revealing signs of mounting losses was the widespread mobilization order. Initially described as a limited call-up, it soon became clear that tens of thousands of reservists were being drafted. Lines formed outside recruitment centers. Videos showed untrained men being rushed to the front with outdated equipment. Families protested, demanding better preparation before deployment. Mass mobilization, something long denied as necessary, had suddenly become unavoidable. Yet, officials continued to insist that core military operations were stable. The decision to mobilize was presented as precautionary, not desperate, despite clear evidence to the contrary. The human cost of these losses cannot be overlooked. Families searched for missing soldiers with little information. Casualty numbers were rarely acknowledged by authorities, leaving relatives in uncertainty. Independent investigations estimated tens of thousands killed or wounded. Military hospitals reportedly overflowed and field camps were set up for treatment. Testimonies from medical staff described injuries consistent with large-scale artillery engagements and poorly coordinated assaults. Despite this, the official line from the Kremlin was that casualties were minimal and progress was steady. Politicians praised bravery while avoiding any admission of strategic failure. As the losses mounted, internal criticism began to emerge. Prominent military bloggers, once staunch supporters, started questioning the competence of high command. They criticized flawed tactical decisions, defensive failures, and lack of coordination. Some demanded accountability for officials who underestimated the enemy. Instead of addressing these concerns publicly, authorities tightened control over speech, issuing warnings and censorship orders. Any narrative suggesting miscalculation was deemed unpatriotic. This rigid stance widened the gap between official messaging and the realities seen on the ground by soldiers and civilians alike. International intelligence agencies released reports confirming the extent of these losses. Satellite images showed large grave sites, damaged convoys, and abandoned outposts. Drone footage provided visual confirmation of key retreats. Documented evidence challenged the Kremlin's repeated reassurance that objectives were being met. Governments shared intercepted communications indicating confusion among logistics officers and commanders. Despite overwhelming proof, Russian officials continued to use the phrase "according to plan," raising questions about whether they were unwilling or unable to acknowledge failure. Experts speculated that admitting setbacks might risk internal instability. Meanwhile, opposing forces exploited the weaknesses. They targeted command centers, supply hubs, and bridges, crippling Russian mobility. Small mobile units conducted surprise offensives, reclaiming territory once claimed as liberated. This exposed how stretched and vulnerable the Russian lines had become. Videos of abandoned weapons and captured troops circulated widely. Each counterattack demonstrated that Russian control was not as firm as claimed. Yet the Kremlin portrayed these events as part of a larger strategy, framing every fallback as a new tactical phase. For many observers, this narrative had become increasingly detached from battlefield truth. Despite mounting pressure, Russian leadership held tightly to their message. Public speeches declared resolve, promising victory regardless of cost. They emphasized historical destiny and national pride. But behind the symbolism, practical issues worsened, ammunition stockpiles dwindled, fuel shortages disrupted operations, communication failures led to friendly fire incidents, orders were sometimes delayed or contradicted. Field commanders reportedly warned superiors about unrealistic objectives. However, concerns were dismissed or downplayed. The insistence that everything was on schedule overshadowed the urgent need for adaptation. The psychological impact of these losses affected both soldiers and civilians. Troops at the front faced constant bombardment with limited rest. Many reported burnout and fatigue. Some units rotated out with drastically reduced numbers. Civilians inside Russia began questioning the narrative, especially as funerals increased. Questions arose about why so many lives were sacrificed if everything was going according to plan. Families demanded transparency, but official channels offered patriotic slogans instead of answers. The gap between lived experience and official messaging became painfully clear. Trust in leadership began to erode among certain circles. Analysts warned that prolonged denial of setbacks could lead to greater crises. Without honest assessment, strategic errors would repeat. As losses mounted, some suggested seeking negotiations, but official rhetoric remained defiant, rejecting compromise and insisting success was near. International observers argued that this refusal prolonged the conflict and deepened suffering. Each statement about being on plan stood in stark contrast with footage of destroyed convoys, chaotic retreats, and grieving families. One of the most debated topics became the question of how long this could continue. With resources strained and international isolation deepening, even loyal insiders wondered about sustainability. Some former officials hinted at mismanagement. Leaked documents suggested growing concern within military ranks, but public discourse remained tightly controlled. Analysts concluded that admitting such failures publicly might threaten political stability. Therefore, the illusion of control had to be maintained, even if it meant denying empirical reality. The phrase, "according to plan," turned into a political shield, protecting leadership from accountability. Despite everything, Russian leadership continued to celebrate symbolic milestones, unveiling medals and promotions. They highlighted minor gains as major achievements, but these gestures felt disconnected given the catastrophic losses accumulating over time. The destruction of modern equipment, depletion of elite units, and loss of strategic ground indicated a long-term weakening of military capability. International experts predicted that rebuilding such capacity could take decades. Still, the narrative of steady progress persisted in state media, reinforcing the illusion of control. As global scrutiny intensified, more leaks emerged from those dissatisfied with silence. Some soldiers posted messages pleading for proper equipment, medical care, or leadership change. Families shared stories of lost loved ones who had never received official acknowledgement. Documents suggested that casualty figures were kept classified to avoid public outrage. This secrecy further fueled speculation that losses were far higher than disclosed. International officials publicly accused Russia of hiding battlefield failures. Yet, despite condemnations, the official narrative remained unchanged. The conflict reached a stage where every new offensive raised concerns about further catastrophic losses. Analysts questioned whether continued assaults offered any strategic gain or simply prolonged the crisis. Reconstruction of damaged units required time and training that were increasingly unavailable. Morale issues resurfaced, with some troops reportedly refusing to advance, but leadership maintained pressure, urging loyalty and sacrifice. The phrase, "according to plan," became a mantra, repeated even as plans visibly faltered. This created a surreal contrast between language and reality. Ultimately, the heavy toll of this conflict may be remembered not just for its devastation, but for how it was publicly portrayed. The insistence on control, the denial of defeat, and the dismissal of evidence revealed a leadership determined to protect its image above all else. But history often judges by results, not rhetoric. As more data becomes available, a clearer picture of the losses will emerge. Entire brigades erased, equipment stockpiles emptied, lives irrevocably changed. These cannot be erased by words, no matter how often repeated. For those studying military strategy, this war will serve as a case study in the consequences of miscalculation and denial. It highlights the danger of ignoring ground realities in favor of political messaging. Effective operations require adaptation, but adaptation becomes impossible if leadership refuses to acknowledge setbacks. The contrast between battlefield truth and official narrative will shape the legacy of this conflict. It serves as a reminder that honesty, even in hardship, is essential for meaningful progress. As we reflect on the catastrophic losses suffered and the unwavering insistence that everything is proceeding according to plan, one must ask, at what point does the cost outweigh the narrative? How many more resources, lives, and futures will be sacrificed to maintain an image of control? The answers remain unclear, but the consequences continue to unfold. The gap between truth and propaganda grows wider. The world watches and history takes note. This story is far from over, and the lessons it carries are profound. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay critical, and we'll continue to bring you deep insights into unfolding global events.